Hey guys, welcome to session 9, our final session for Linux System Administration Intermediate Level. As always, I'm your instructor Kevin Downs, and this is a course by coding-bootcamps.com. Today, we're going over network file systems. So as a quick recap, last session we went over configure Samba for Linux to Linux Unix file sharing, configuring Samba for Linux to Windows file sharing, using the SMB client utility to transfer files, and mount and connect Samba shares to Linux and Windows clients. Today, we're using NFS to access remote file systems, configuring the NFS server, configuring the NFS client, and exporting file systems from the NFS server to the NFS client. So guys, what is NFS? So Network File System is a popular distributed file system protocol that enables users to mount remote directories on their server. The system lets you leverage storage space in a different location and write onto the same space from multiple servers in an effortless manner. It thus works fairly well for directories that users need to access frequently. So guys, in short, what this is doing is you have server A, which is the server you're on, and then you have server B that has a directory that you want to access, but you don't want to have to keep taking files from server B and keep taking it over to server A. You want to just be able to log on to server A and just see the files that are contained in the directory or file system on server B. That's what this does, right? It mounts it for you so that you can directly access it without having to go to the other server or without having to pull files back to your server A, okay? So we have NFS version 4, which works through firewalls and on the internet, and it no longer requires an RPC bind service, supports ACLs, and it utilizes stateful operations. RedHat Enterprise Linux 6 supports NFS version 2, NFS version 3, and NFS version 4 clients. When mounting a file system via NFS, RedHat Enterprise Linux uses NFS 4 by default if the server supports it. All versions of NFS can use Transfer Control Protocol, or TCP, running over an IP network, with NFS 4 requiring it. NFS v2 and v3 can use the User Datagram Protocol, which is UDP, running over an IP network to provide a stateless network connection between the client and server. So once the shared directory is created, you must open the etc exports file in the text editor with root privileges using the following command. So you would do sudo to sudo up to privileged user, and you do nano, vim, vi, whatever editor you want to use, and then you would edit the etc/exports file. So the files that will appear would contain a few comments to tell you the general structure of each configuration line. Essentially, the syntax would be similar to the following. So you're going to see the directory to share, you're going to see the client, and then what options you want to use for that client. Now guys, I'll go to my VirtualBox and just kind of show you that file. It's empty though, because we don't have any NFS shares set up. But at least I can show you that it does exist. Oops. There we go. Alright. Guys, if you remember from my last session, remember I told you I was going to change that host name and it wouldn't really change until I rebooted my server? Well, there you go. Now you see that it did actually change my host name, if you recall from those other sessions. But anyways, that's a different subject. So we can do a cd, or we can do a cat/etc/exports, and it's not going to bring anything back, okay? Notice it didn't say, hey, that file doesn't exist. It just didn't put anything back. Why? Well, that's because this file's empty, right? We don't have any NFS shares set up, all right? So I can't really show you what's in there, right? But I do want to show you that it does exist on your server, or on your machine. So let's go back to the PowerPoint. So this is how it will be set up in that file. Again, the directory you want to share, the client you're sharing it to, and any options you want to add to it. So guys, the aim here is to be able to create a line for each of the directories that must be shared. So for every directory that you want to share, you have to put in a new line in that file, okay? Since in our chosen example the IP happens to be 333.333.333.333, the line should look something like this in that file, okay? It should be /home, so we want to share home, and we're going to send it to this IP address, and we're going to put it with these options here. RW, sync, no root squash, no subtree check, okay? We also want to share a separate one called var NFS to the same IP with the same or similar options here. So we're going to take a look at these options here, guys. So the first one's going to be read-write, okay? This option allows the client computer to read as well as write access to the volume. The next one's going to be sync. It forces NFS to write changes to the disk before replying, thus resulting in a more stable and consistent environment. Okay, this is primarily because the reply replicates the actual state of the remote volume. We also have no subtree check. This option averts subtree checking, which is a process that compels the host to check if the file is actually still available and export a tree for each request. It may create problems when a file is renamed with the client that it has open. For the same reason, in roughly all of the cases, it is advisable to disable subtree checking. We also have no root squash, which by default, the NFS translates requests from a root user remotely into a non-privileged one on the server. This is meant to be a security feature that does not allow a root account on the client to use the file system of the host as root. Okay? Obviously, you don't want to be giving people root access that don't need it. Okay? So let's talk about configuring the clients. We just set up the host. So let me go back a few slides. So we set up, we're from the server that we want to share the file. We set it up here through the etc exports file. Now we're setting up the client, or where we're sending the files to. Okay. The actual directories will correspond with their location on the host server. We can create each directory and the necessary parent directories by typing this. So we can sudo up, do a make directory -p. And guys, this -p option stands for parent. So what that means is, say we make this directory mount NFS home. If mount or NFS doesn't exist, it's going to go ahead and create those directories for us. Okay, that way it doesn't come back and say, hey, mount doesn't exist, NFS doesn't exist. By using this -p option, it just makes those in case they don't exist already, okay? Next, we would do a sudo make directory -p mount NFS var NFS. So now that we have some place to put our remote shares, we can mount them by addressing our host server, which in this example is going to be 1.2.3.4. So we do it like this. We would do sudo mount 1.2.3.4 /home. Okay, and this is a space here. Mount NFS home. Okay. We have an second example here. If we want to mount this directory, we do mount 1.2.3.4 /var.nfs or /nfs. So this is what we want to mount. It's going to mount to /mount NFS var NFS. Okay. So if you want to see all the shares that you have mounted, you can type this command, mount -t NFS. All right. And I would go to my machine to show this, but we don't have any mounted, right? So it's not going to show anything, okay? So just know that this is the command you would do to see the shares. So you can test the access to your shares by writing something to your shares. You can write a test file to one of your shares like this, okay? So I could do a touch mount NFS home and then test home. Let me go back a slide. So this is that directory here. So we're just making a file under home called test home, okay? And then we could just go to our other server and see, okay, is this file there? Can I access it? If it is, then your NFS share is working correctly. So we can write a test file to other share as well to demonstrate an important difference. So see here we have a touch mount NFS var NFS test var NFS. Okay. So we can do that to test the other one as well. So let's talk about how to export file systems from the NFS server to the NFS client. All right. So we would start with the server system that exports, meaning the host one, okay? And we make available to the client system. So the contents of the directory would make available to the client systems. So on the server, you must run the NFS service and designate one or more file systems to export. To export a file system, you have to add an appropriate entry into the etc exports files, like we talked about earlier. So let's suppose that you want to export the home directory, and you want to enable the host named lnbp75. And you want to mount this file system for read and write operations. So guys, we can do this by adding the following entry to the etc exports file. /home space lnbp75 parentheses rw comma sync close parentheses. Okay. So if you want to give access to all hosts on a certain LAN, such as 192.168.0.0, you could change this line to /home space 192.168.0.0/24. And guys, this /24 is the subnet mask here. That's what that is. Okay. And we can do parentheses, read write, comma, sync, parentheses. Okay. So let me go to the virtual machine real quick. Kind of type that out for you. So I can do a vi/etsy/exports. So if I want to do that last example there, I'd hit I for insert, or that first example, I would do home space LNBP75 parentheses, open parentheses, RW, comma, sync, close parentheses. Now guys, it's really important to know that you can't put a space in between these two. If we did this, what would actually happen is you would say, okay, for this host, just do the default settings or permissions on there, okay? And then because we have a space here, it would think, okay, and then for all other hosts, allow these settings, okay? So that's bad. We don't want that. So make sure there is no space in between these two, okay? If we want to use that other example there, we would do /home 192.168.0.0/24. We want to give read write and sync settings. Okay, so that's kind of how we do that. I'm not going to save this, guys, otherwise it's going to kind of mess with my system a little bit, but that's how we would do it. And that's assuming that this is the server we're exporting things or sending files to other clients. Okay, let's go back to our PowerPoint here. So guys, every file in the Etsy exports file has this general format. You're going to have the directory that you want to share. Then you're going to have a space. Then you're going to have host 1, no space, the options you want to give it, and then a space, host 2, and the options you want to give it, and so on and so forth. You could do this multiple times with many hosts that you want to send the directory to. Okay. So the first field is the directory being shared via NFS, and that's followed by one or more fields that specify which hosts can mount that directory remotely. And then you want to, and then you can put the several options in the parentheses here. So you can specify the host with names or IP addresses, including ranges of IP addresses. Okay. Keep in mind though that you can only use a host name that can be resolved by your machine. All right. If you give it a host name that's never seen before or doesn't know how to resolve it, it's going to fail out. So it might be better to just put IP addresses so that you know those will work. Okay. The options in the parentheses denote the kind of access each host is granted and how user and group IDs from the server are mapped to the ID client. If a file is owned by root on the server, for example, what owner is that on the client, okay? So within the parentheses, comma, separate the options. If a host is allowed both read and write access and all IDs are to be mapped to the anonymous user, the options look like this, okay? Guys, by default, the anonymous user is named nobody. So we can, we look at here, read, write, all, squash, okay? And you use two types of options when setting. You use general options and you use user ID mapping options, okay? So let's summarize. We talked about using NFS to access remote file systems, configuring the NFS server, configuring the NFS client, and exporting file systems from the NFS server to the NFS client. Guys, definitely follow these links to get a little bit of extra help on some of the topics we covered. We have weekly and monthly plans available for system administrator management, as well as private tutoring sessions for Linux and Bash scripting. Be sure to continue your system admin training with Intro to Cybersecurity, Introduction to Cloud Technology, and learn how to manage Windows servers. There's also Introduction to Database Design, learn SQL programming by examples, Introduction to NoSQL Database Design, learn Graph Database Design by examples. Here's some resources you can follow for a little bit extra information. What is Linux operating systems and how it works? What are directory tree and file system hierarchies in Linux? Introduction to Linux file systems for sysadmins, and an overview of Linux virtual memory and disk buffer cache. There's also best practices for monitoring Linux systems, best practices for performing Linux boots and shutdowns, and best practices for making and managing backup operations. Guys, some classes to follow up in conjunction with this one is Learn PHP Programming, Web Development with PHP and MySQL, Advanced Linux Bash Scripting, which will be one that I actually teach, Introduction to HTML and CSS, and Introduction to Python Programming. These are going to follow everything that we've just learned nicely, so it'd be a good idea to kind of jump into these courses next. Thank you so much, guys, for joining me on this course. I hope you learned a lot, and I hope as an intermediate level now, you're really starting to understand how these systems kind of work together and realize that Linux is a very useful system and it can really do a lot, all right? All right, guys, so after this, we're going to be talking about some of the homework and projects we can do to kind of concrete some of these ideas in your head. Looking forward to seeing you there.